There is a particular kind of power that does not arrive by conquest. It does not march in with an army or announce itself with a crown. It arrives dressed as a wanderer, smelling of sweat and candle smoke, with dirt still under its fingernails. It speaks in the plain language of villages, not palaces. And by the time anyone with real authority understands what has happened, it is already sitting at the emperor's table, whispering into the ear of an empress, deciding which ministers keep their jobs and which are quietly destroyed. In January of 1905, soldiers opened fire on a peaceful crowd outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Within 2 years, a barely literate Siberian peasant named Grigori Rasputin is walking those same palace halls as a personal friend of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Empress Alexandra. He cannot properly read a government document. He has never held a title, never worn a uniform, never governed so much as a village council. And yet, for the last decade of the Russian Empire's existence, this one man will hold more informal influence over the government of 170 million people than most of the empire's ministers combined. He healed a dying child, or seemed to. He preached that sin was the doorway to salvation, and then lived accordingly. He was called a saint by a queen and a devil by half of Russia, sometimes in the very same week. He survived a knife through the stomach that should have killed him in minutes. And when the men who despised him finally decided to end his life, it took poison, bullets, and a freezing river to do it. And even then, the manner of his dying became one of the most disputed events in modern history. This is the story of how a man from nowhere reached into the machinery of an empire and helped pull it apart from the inside. Get comfortable. This is a long story, and it rewards patience. We begin, as Rasputin's own life began, in the coldest, most forgotten corner of the Russian Empire. The village of Pokrovskoye sits on the banks of the Tura River in western Siberia, 1,000 miles east of Moscow, where winters last half the year and the nearest city is a 2-day journey by cart. In the 1860s, it is the kind of place history does not bother to record. Peasants farm, peasants pray, peasants die young. It is here, on the 9th of January 1869, by the old Russian calendar, that Anna Parshakova gives birth to a son she names Grigori. He is the first of her children to survive infancy. 8 others will die before adulthood. In a household defined by loss, the boy who lives becomes, almost by necessity, the boy who is watched closely, for signs, for meaning, for some explanation of why he alone was spared. His father, Yefim, is a farmer, a part-time government courier, and a church elder, a man of modest standing in a village that has almost none to offer. There are no photographs of Grigori as a child. There is no record of his schooling, because there was none. He grows up illiterate, as nearly every Siberian peasant does, learning the world through labor and liturgy rather than books. What we do know is thin, and what fills the gaps afterward is mostly invented by people with an agenda. Village records mention a hot temper, a public shouting match with local authorities that earns him 2 nights in a jail cell. There are whispered stories of horse theft that were, for decades, repeated as settled fact in nearly every biography written about him. Historian Douglas Smith spent years combing through the actual Siberian archive material and found no such record, no charge, no conviction, just rumor, retold so many times that it hardened into history. Here is the first named contradiction of Rasputin's life. The man remembered by the world as a wild-eyed criminal in his youth left behind almost no evidence of criminality at all. What he left behind instead is a black hole, Douglas Smith's own phrase for it. Nearly 30 years of a human life that simply cannot be verified. At 19, in the town of Abalak, he meets a peasant girl named Praskovia Dubrovina. They marry in February of 1887. She will bear him 7 children. Only 3 survive. She will stay loyal to him for the rest of his life, through infidelities that became legendary and absences that stretched for months, sometimes years. When you picture the wife left behind while a husband chases some higher purpose, you are picturing a story as old as marriage itself. But rarely does the higher purpose end with the husband dining beside an empress while the wife remains, unnamed and unmentioned, in a Siberian farmhouse. Something shifts in him near the end of that first decade of marriage. He will later describe a vision. The Virgin Mary, he claims, or perhaps a local saint. No one can confirm it. No one can disprove it. What is certain is that a 28-year-old husband and father, 10 years into an ordinary peasant life, abruptly walks away from all of it. He leaves behind the farm, the wife, the infant children. He goes looking for God, or for something he does not yet have a name for. Whatever it is, it will take him further than any Pokrovskoye peasant has ever gone. To understand why a Siberian wanderer could walk into the innermost circle of the most powerful family in Russia, you first have to understand how fragile that family already was. Nicholas II did not inherit a stable throne. He inherited a system already straining under its own weight. By the turn of the 20th century, Russia is an empire built on a contradiction it refuses to resolve. It is trying to industrialize like Germany and Britain, while governing like a medieval monarchy. Peasants who had been serfs within living memory now work in factories, organize, and read pamphlets about revolution. The aristocracy remains dazzlingly wealthy and almost entirely disconnected from the people it rules. And sitting above all of it is a Tsar who believes, with total sincerity, that he holds his throne by divine right, a belief his own father drilled into him, and one that 18th century Europe had already begun to abandon. In 1905, that contradiction erupts. Economic hardship from the disastrous war with Japan combines with decades of resentment, and Russia is rocked by strikes, mutinies, and open revolt. Nicholas survives it, but only by making concessions he never wanted to make. A parliament, a freer press, expanded civil rights. The revolution of 1905 does not overthrow the Romanovs. It does something arguably more dangerous for them. It proves they can be shaken. There is something else happening inside the palace walls that has nothing to do with politics, and everything to do with why Rasputin's timing was so devastatingly precise. The Russian aristocracy, bored with formal orthodoxy and hungry for meaning, had developed an intense fascination with the occult, spiritualism, theosophy, foreign mystics. Before Rasputin, there was a Frenchman named Philippe, a self-declared healer who had already gained the Tsarina's trust and convinced her he could help her conceive a son. When growing anti-foreign sentiment forced his exile, Philippe reportedly left the Empress with a prophecy that God would send another holy man to take his place. You have likely felt some version of this yourself. The moment when a system you trust seems to be failing, and you find yourself drawn to whoever offers certainty, regardless of their credentials. That instinct is not unique to Romanov Russia. It is a permanent feature of frightened people in unstable times. And there is one more fact that made this particular family more vulnerable than almost any other royal house in Europe. Alexandra, the German-born empress, carried the gene for hemophilia, inherited through her grandmother, Queen Victoria. Her only son and heir, Alexei, was born with it, a condition where the blood does not clot, where a minor bruise can become an internal catastrophe. The empire needed an heir. The heir's survival was never guaranteed. Into that terror, in November of 1905, walked a Siberian peasant the Tsar's diary describes simply as a man of God from Tobolsk province. Before there was a court, there was a root cellar. Back in Pokrovskoye, in his father's own house, Rasputin built a small chapel underground and gathered a handful of relatives and neighbors for prayer meetings that quickly became the subject of village gossip. There were rumors that female followers ritually washed him before each session. There were rumors of strange singing, of behavior that edged toward the sexual. Whether or not those rumors were accurate, they established something crucial about Rasputin's method from the very beginning. Intimacy, secrecy, and a small circle of devoted women formed the architecture of his influence long before he ever set foot in St. Petersburg. It is worth pausing on the theology itself because it is stranger and more coherent than most retellings allow. Rasputin preached that closeness to God required first confronting sin, not avoiding it, but moving through it. Repentance, in his framework, only had meaning if there was something real to repent. It is not difficult to see how convenient this philosophy became for a man with an appetite for wine and women. It is also true that versions of this idea existed in fringe currents of Russian folk Christianity long before Rasputin arrived, absorbed during his years of wandering among sects that blended orthodoxy with older, half-pagan traditions. He did not invent the doctrine, he simply lived it more openly and more usefully than anyone before him. By 1903 or 1904, word of a compelling Siberian starets, an elder, a holy wanderer, reaches the city of Kazan, and from there, letters of introduction carry him to St. Petersburg itself. He arrives in a capital hungry for exactly what he is selling, an unpolished, unfiltered connection to the peasant soul of Russia, delivered by a man the aristocracy could tell themselves was untouched by their own corruption. Church leaders like the influential archimandrite Theophan take him in, house him, and open doors that a peasant from Tyumen province should never have been able to open on his own. This is your first present-day anchor. When you watch an outsider candidate promise to fix a broken system precisely because they have never been part of it, you are watching a very old story repeat itself. St. Petersburg's elite believed Rasputin's crude manners were proof of his authenticity. They mistook a lack of polish for a lack of ambition. On the 1st of November 1905, Rasputin meets Nicholas and Alexandra for the first time at the Peterhof Palace. It is by every account an unremarkable meeting, a curious Tsar recording in his diary that he had met a man of God. No one in that room could have known they were watching the opening scene of the Romanov Dynasty's final chapter. The door was small, but once it opened, it never fully closed again. Here is the part of the story most retellings get wrong. Rasputin did not seize power the way a general or a minister seizes power. He built something quieter and, in its own way, more durable. A private channel directly into the emotional life of the Empress, unmonitored by cabinet, church, or court. The mechanism was simple, and it centered on one person, Alexei, the Tsarevich, the hemophiliac heir upon whom the entire future of the dynasty depended. In the spring of 1907, the boy suffers an internal hemorrhage. Alexandra, desperate, summons Rasputin to pray over him. By morning, the bleeding has stopped. No doctor can explain it. In the summer of 1912, a jolting carriage ride triggers a hemorrhage so severe that the boy is delirious with fever and the family quietly prepares a funeral announcement. Alexandra sends Rasputin, who is back in Siberia, a desperate telegram. His reply arrives quickly. God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much. The bleeding stops the following day. The court physician, a man named Fedorov, later admits the recovery was, in his own words, wholly inexplicable from a medical standpoint. Notice what has just happened, structurally. Whatever the true cause, and we will return to this, Rasputin has positioned himself as the only reliable variable standing between the empire's only heir and death. That is not political power in any conventional sense. It is something closer to psychological ownership. Once a mother believes one man alone can save her child's life, that mother will defend him against any accusation, dismiss any scandal, fire any servant who dares to warn her. And that is precisely the system Rasputin built. Anna Vyrabova, the Empress's closest friend, becomes his most devoted advocate inside the palace, carrying messages and defending his reputation. When a nursery governess named Sofia Tayutcheva grows alarmed at Rasputin's unsupervised access to the young Grand Duchesses in their nightgowns and demands he be barred, it is Tayutcheva who loses her position, not Rasputin. When a nanny named Maria Vishnyakova accuses him of rape, Alexandra refuses to believe her and insists that everything Rasputin does is holy. This is the system in full architecture. Healer to the heir, spiritual confessor to the empress, untouchable by scandal because scandal itself had already been pre-classified in Alexandra's mind as slander from Rasputin's jealous enemies. He did not need a ministry. He had built something the entire imperial bureaucracy could not touch, the unconditional faith of the one woman whose husband ruled an empire. To understand Rasputin honestly, you have to sit for a moment inside his own worldview, uncomfortable as that may be. Formal Russian orthodoxy, as practiced by trained clergy, could feel distant from the daily lives of ordinary peasants. Ritualized, abstract, delivered in a register that assumed education Rasputin never had. What Rasputin offered instead was scripture, filtered through a peasant's direct, plain-spoken intensity. He had memorized long passages simply by hearing them repeated, and he preached them with an emotional directness that trained priests, bound by liturgical formality, often could not match. This alone explains a great deal of his early popularity. People who had never felt spoken to by their own church suddenly felt seen. But the theology went further, and this is the part worth understanding on its own terms rather than dismissing outright. Rasputin argued that humility required lived experience of one's own weakness. A person who never sinned, in his framework, could never truly know what it meant to be forgiven, and therefore could never fully surrender to God. Repentance was not a formality. It was a transformation that could only happen after genuine transgression. Some of the fringe religious sects Rasputin encountered during his years of wandering, communities that blended orthodoxy with older folk mysticism, carried versions of this idea to extremes, engaging in intense, ecstatic rituals as a means of confronting and then repenting from sin. There is no reliable evidence Rasputin ever formally belonged to one of these sects, despite persistent rumors that he was a member of the Klisti. But he had walked among people who lived this philosophy, and something of it clearly took root in him. Understood generously, this is a theology of radical humility, an argument that spiritual pride, the sin of believing oneself already righteous, is more dangerous than ordinary human weakness. Understood cynically, it is the most convenient religious doctrine ever constructed by a man who liked wine and women and did not want to stop enjoying either. Both readings are probably true at once. Rasputin does not appear to have been performing hypocrisy so much as living inside a genuine and self-serving contradiction, a man who believed his own indulgences were part of a holy process, even as those same indulgences devastated the people around him, from the wife he abandoned in Pokrovskoye to the women who later accused him of assault. This is the first uncomfortable empathy of this story. It is easy to call Rasputin a fraud who simply exploited religious language for personal gratification. It is harder, and more honest, to admit that he may have genuinely believed what he preached, that the line between a con man and a true believer, running his own confidence trick on himself, is sometimes impossible to locate. Rasputin was not the first religious figure in history to build a doctrine that happened to excuse his own worst impulses. He will not be the last. There is a story about Rasputin that appears in nearly every biography written before the 21st century. It goes like this. Rasputin, wildly drunk in a Moscow hotel, climbs onto a table, exposes himself in front of the entire room, and shouts that this is the altar at which the empress worships. It is one of the most quoted anecdotes in the entire Rasputin legend. It is also, according to the archival work of historian Douglas Smith, almost certainly invented. Smith went looking for the incident in the surveillance files of the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, who tailed Rasputin for years and documented his movements in exhaustive, sometimes absurd detail. The actual records show something almost comically ordinary. Rasputin visited the hotel, drank a few glasses of wine, and left. No table, no exposure, no blasphemous declaration. What Smith found instead were letters, written by a police official who despised Rasputin as a peasant interloper who had no business standing where he stood. In these letters, the official instructs his subordinates to fabricate compromising stories, explicitly telling them to make each new tale more outrageous than the last. By the end of this campaign, Rasputin is being blamed for conspiracies involving the sale of used military underwear. The hotel story was simply one lie among dozens manufactured in this same operation. A British agent's memoir later repeated the story as an eyewitness account, except the same agent's private diary from that period places him nowhere near Moscow on the night in question. Here is the second named contradiction, and it cuts against the popular myth rather than in favor of it. The man remembered by history as an uncontrolled degenerate was, in this particular and frequently cited case, the victim of a deliberate disinformation campaign run by people who had every institutional advantage over him and used it anyway. That does not mean Rasputin was innocent of the underlying accusation, heavy drinking and womanizing. The historical record, including credible accusations of assault, leaves no real doubt that his private conduct caused genuine harm to real people. But it does mean something important about how legends form. When you hear a wild story about a public figure today, a story that confirms exactly what you already suspected about them, ask who benefits from you believing it, and whether anyone has actually checked the original source. The aristocracy that despised Rasputin did not need to invent every scandal. They needed only to make the true ones louder, and add invented ones until no one could tell the difference. When the fabricated hotel story eventually reached Alexandra, she laughed it off as too absurd to believe, and from that moment forward, dismissed even the true stories about Rasputin's conduct as more of the same manufactured slander. By 1914, the pressure surrounding Rasputin had become physically dangerous. In July of that year, outside his own home in Pokrovskoye, a woman named Kionia Guseva approaches him and drives a long dagger into his stomach, screaming that she has killed the Antichrist. Rasputin runs, bleeding, through the village streets as she chases him to finish the attack. He survives, barely, and only after emergency surgery and a long hospitalization, during which doctors expect him to die. Guseva was a follower of a defrocked priest named Iliodor, once a Rasputin ally turned bitter enemy after learning of his sexual conduct. Both Rasputin and the police believed Iliodor had orchestrated the attack, though he fled the country before facing questioning. It is the second time in this story that Rasputin should have died and did not. It will not be the last. Weeks later, Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary and Germany. Rasputin, recovering from his stab wound, does something almost no one else in the Russian government dares to do. He predicts catastrophe in writing and sends it directly to the Tsar. A terrible storm cloud lies over Russia, he warns. Disaster, grief, murky darkness, and no light. A whole ocean of tears and so much blood. We will all drown in blood. He goes further, publicly declaring that if Russia enters the war, it will mean the end of the monarchy, the end of the Romanovs, and the end of Russian institutions altogether. Nicholas ignores him. Russia goes to war, and within 3 years, every part of that prophecy comes true. It is tempting to read this as evidence of genuine mystical foresight, and the temptation deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. But it is also true that Rasputin had, by 1914, spent nearly a decade inside the machinery of a crumbling government. He had watched the aristocracy's contempt for the peasantry up close. He had seen how thin the loyalty of the army and the bureaucracy really was. A man who understands a system's weaknesses from the inside does not need supernatural power to predict its collapse. He only needs to be paying closer attention than everyone insulated by privilege around him. When the war goes badly, and it goes badly almost immediately, Nicholas makes a decision that will hand Rasputin more real influence than he had ever held before. In September of 1915, the Tsar leaves the capital to personally command the army at the front, leaving the government of Russia, in practice, to his wife. And his wife's most trusted advisor is a Siberian peasant with no formal role in government whatsoever. You are about to watch what happens when informal influence over one grieving mother becomes, almost by accident, effective control over a wartime government of 170 million people. With Nicholas away at the front, Alexandra begins governing by letter, and her letters are saturated with Rasputin's opinions, which she repeats back to her husband nearly verbatim, always referring to Rasputin as our friend. Ministers who displease Rasputin are dismissed. Ministers who flatter him are promoted. Within roughly a year and a half, Russia churns through 4 different prime ministers, 5 ministers of internal affairs, 3 ministers of war, and 3 foreign ministers. A level of turnover so dizzying that contemporaries began calling it ministerial leapfrog. Some of these appointments had legitimate causes unrelated to Rasputin, but enough of them traced directly back to his preferences that the pattern became impossible for the aristocracy to ignore. Zoom out, and the strategic picture is catastrophic. A nation at war, hemorrhaging soldiers on the Eastern Front, is simultaneously purging its own government of competent administrators in favor of men whose primary qualification is the approval of an uneducated mystic. Zoom in, and the human cost becomes specific. Millions of Russian soldiers are dying in a war effort undermined by supply failures and command chaos, while the capital simmers with rumors that the war is being deliberately sabotaged by German sympathizers inside the palace itself. This rumor was not entirely without a target. Alexandra had been born a German princess, and although there is no credible evidence, not then, not in later historical research, not in German archives that have since been examined, that she or Rasputin ever communicated with German intelligence, the accusation was too politically convenient not to spread. The aristocracy could not blame the Tsar directly. That came dangerously close to treason. They could not easily blame themselves. But here was a foreign-born empress and a peasant mystic, both conveniently outside the traditional halls of power, both easy to cast as outsiders whose loyalty could be questioned. Rasputin became, in the most literal sense, a scapegoat, a single visible villain onto whom an entire failing system could project its failures. This is your second present-day anchor. When an institution fails at scale, look at who gets blamed publicly and ask whether that person actually held the power attributed to them, or whether they simply provided a convenient, singular face for a much larger and more diffuse failure. Rasputin absolutely exploited his access for personal gain, extracting bribes, protecting favorites, punishing enemies. But the war was not lost because of a Siberian peasant's opinions about cabinet appointments. The war was lost because of decades of structural rot that predated Rasputin by a generation, and would have destroyed the monarchy with or without him. By late 1916, a right-wing Duma politician named Vladimir Purishkevich stands before parliament and declares that the Tsar's ministers have become marionettes, their strings pulled by Rasputin and by an empress he calls, openly, the evil genius of Russia. The speech does not fall on deaf ears. Among those listening is a young aristocrat named Felix Yusupov, heir to the richest family in the empire, richer in fact than the Romanovs themselves. He is already planning something. Before the story moves toward its ending, it deserves to sit, honestly, with both sides of the argument that has surrounded Rasputin for over a century. The case for the defenders begins with genuine testimony from people who had no reason to lie. The children of the imperial family, by every credible account, adored him and felt entirely at ease in his presence. Testimony that stands in sharp contrast to the darker rumors about his conduct toward the Grand Duchesses, rumors that multiple historians, after examining the record, consider almost certainly false. He was, by numerous independent accounts, extraordinarily generous, frequently taking the very bribes pressed into his hands by wealthy petitioners and redistributing the money to beggars and peasants outside his own apartment. By the standards of his era, he preached a strikingly tolerant theology, extending acceptance to Jews and Muslims and, according to some accounts, showing more openness toward homosexuality within the church than the institution itself displayed. He was, from his first public statements about the war, a consistent voice for peace in a court otherwise eager for military glory, and history proved his warnings correct in every particular. None of this fits comfortably into the caricature of pure villainy that later propaganda constructed around him. The case for the critics is, if anything, more thoroughly documented. He was credibly accused of rape on at least one occasion by a former devotee who had once trusted him completely. He conducted affairs with a wide range of women, from prostitutes to the wives of noblemen, while his own wife remained loyally at home in Siberia raising the children he rarely saw. He accepted bribes not only from the desperate poor, but from ambitious officials seeking political favors, and used his access to have opponents removed from office regardless of their competence. He drank to genuine excess, by his own family's later admission, and treated his growing fame with an arrogance that alienated even some of his earliest supporters. Notice that both cases can be entirely true at once. Rasputin's generosity toward beggars does not erase his exploitation of vulnerable women. His accurate prophecy about the war does not undo the real damage caused by his interference in wartime governance. The 19th century Russian public, and much of the popular history written since, wanted a simple answer: devil or saint. Neither serves the actual man half as well as the discomfort of holding both truths simultaneously. What can be said with real confidence, drawing on the archival work of historians like Douglas Smith, is this: the version of Rasputin as pure supernatural evil was constructed largely after his death, by a monarchist and later revolutionary press that each needed him to be the singular cause of a catastrophe that was, in truth, produced by an entire system. The real man was messier, more human, and in some ways more disturbing than the myth. Because a myth can be safely condemned, while a genuinely complicated person cannot. It is the evening of the 16th of December 1916, in Petrograd, the city that had been renamed from St. Petersburg only 2 years earlier in a wave of anti-German sentiment. The temperature outside sits well below freezing. Snow has been falling for days. Inside the Moika Palace, home to the wealthiest family in Russia, Prince Felix Yusupov is making final preparations for a dinner that will never actually take place. The conspirators number 4, though more may have been involved. Yusupov, the aristocrat with the most personal grievance and the most to lose from Rasputin's continued influence over the court. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar himself, whose participation would later shield the group from full prosecution. Vladimir Purushkevich, the same politician whose speech in Parliament had helped crystallize public hatred into action, and a military doctor whose task is to prepare the poison. Rasputin is invited under the pretense of meeting Yusupov's wife, Irina, a woman he had reportedly expressed romantic interest in, though she was not, in reality, even in the city that night. He arrives at the Moika Palace shortly after midnight, and Yusupov leads him down into a small basement room set up to look like an ordinary study. What happens next depends entirely on whose account you believe, and this is precisely the point where the story stops being history and becomes legend. According to Yusupov's own memoir, the only detailed account of the murder that exists, written by the one man with every reason to make himself look heroic, Rasputin is offered wine and small cakes laced with enough cyanide, by Yusupov's own estimate, to kill several men. He eats, he drinks, nothing happens. Yusupov, panicking, goes upstairs, retrieves a revolver from Grand Duke Dmitry, returns to the basement, and shoots Rasputin once in the chest at close range. The conspirators believe him dead. They leave the basement to stage a cover story, having one member of the group wear Rasputin's coat and drive to his apartment to make it appear he had returned home safely that night. When Yusupov comes back downstairs to confirm the body, Rasputin, according to this same account, suddenly opens his eyes, rises, and attacks him, then flees up the stairs and out into the palace courtyard on all fours. Purushkevich, waiting outside, fires, and finally brings him down in the snow. You have likely heard some version of this story before, perhaps as a piece of trivia, the man who could not be killed. What almost no popular retelling mentions is that nearly every dramatic detail in it comes from a single, self-interested source. And in the century since, that source has been quietly, systematically taken apart. Rasputin's body is pulled from beneath the ice of the Little Nevka River on the 1st of January 1917, roughly 200 meters downstream from the bridge where the conspirators had dumped him. The city's senior autopsy surgeon, Dmitry Kosoratov, conducts the examination. His original written report was later lost, but Kosoratov spoke about his findings on the record afterward, and those statements are the closest thing history has to ground truth. He found 3 gunshot wounds, one of them a close-range shot to the forehead, a wound that does not appear anywhere in Yusupov's published account of the killing. He found signs of severe trauma, some of which, in his professional judgment, had been inflicted after death rather than during the struggle Yusupov described. He found no water in Rasputin's lungs, which means the persistent legend that he was still alive when thrown into the freezing river, drowning, rather than dying from his wounds, is almost certainly false. And in direct contradiction to decades of lurid retelling, he found Rasputin's body, including his genitals, entirely intact, despite later stories claiming a grotesque mutilation. There is no forensic evidence of poisoning at all. Rasputin's own daughter later insisted her father avoided sweet foods and would never have eaten the cakes Yusupov claimed he consumed so eagerly. Modern historians examining the case on the centenary of the murder have concluded that the truth was almost certainly less theatrical than the legend. A man shot, likely more than once, by conspirators who then embellished their own account into something closer to a battle against the supernatural, because a mundane assassination made for a far less flattering story about their own courage than a duel against an unkillable monster. Here is the callback, transformed by everything you now know. In Section 1, you heard that Rasputin survived a stab wound that should have killed him. That much is documented and true. But the far more famous version of his death, the poison that failed, the revived corpse, the desperate flight through the snow, appears to be manufactured by the very men who killed him, for the same reason the Moscow hotel story was manufactured by a police chief who despised him. Because an ordinary truth does not serve the story a powerful person once told about themselves. Purishkevich told 2 soldiers and a policeman about the killing within hours, apparently unable to resist boasting, though he asked them to keep quiet. They did not. The murder becomes public knowledge before the body is even found. No one is meaningfully prosecuted. Grand Duke Dmitri's royal blood and Yusupov's family fortune place them beyond the reach of ordinary justice, even for killing a man in cold blood. The empire that Rasputin had helped destabilize could not even manage to hold his killers accountable. Within 3 months, that empire will cease to exist altogether. Step back now from Rasputin the individual, because his life is only half the story. The other half belongs to the institution that made him possible, and that institution's failures reveal something far larger than one peasant's ambition. An autocracy that concentrates all real decision-making power in a single family, insulated from ordinary accountability, creates exactly the vulnerability that Rasputin exploited. There was no meaningful mechanism by which a Russian minister, however competent, could override the private judgment of an empress who believed a single mystic held her son's life in his hands. The very structure that was supposed to guarantee stability, absolute, hereditary, divinely justified rule, turned out to have no defense whatsoever against one persuasive outsider gaining the trust of one frightened mother. Consider too the role played by the church. Formal orthodoxy, rigid and distant from ordinary peasant life, created exactly the hunger that Rasputin's plain-spoken preaching satisfied. An institution meant to provide spiritual guidance to an entire population had grown so disconnected from that population that a barely literate wanderer could out-preach its own trained clergy simply by sounding more human. And consider the aristocracy's own hypocrisy. The same elites who were captivated by foreign mystics like Philippe before Rasputin ever arrived turned around and condemned Rasputin specifically for his peasant origins, revealing that their objection was never really about mysticism at all. It was about a commoner daring to hold influence they believed belonged only to people of noble blood. This is your third present-day anchor. Every institution that insulates its most powerful decision-makers from outside scrutiny, whether a monarchy, a corporation, or a government agency, creates exactly this kind of vulnerability. It is not usually a single villain who causes the collapse. It is a structure with no functioning checks, waiting for the right person to walk through the door it left unguarded. And here is the deepest irony of the entire Rasputin story. Killing him did not fix anything. Purishkevich and Yusupov believed, apparently in total sincerity, that removing one man would restore the monarchy's credibility and save the empire from collapse. Instead, Rasputin's death is followed within 10 weeks by Nicholas's abdication, and within a year by the execution of the entire imperial family in a basement in Yekaterinburg. A death eerily, uncomfortably close to the manner in which Rasputin himself had died, in a room below ground level, at the hands of men who believed they were righting a wrong. The system that produced Rasputin did not need Rasputin to fail. It only needed him as its most visible symptom. The disease itself, a rigid autocracy that refused every meaningful reform until reform was no longer possible, killed the Romanovs regardless of what happened to their mystic. The Bolsheviks, who seized power within a year of Rasputin's death, had no interest in defending the Romanovs' reputation, but they found his story extraordinarily useful anyway. A peasant, corrupting an empire from within, became convenient proof of the entire monarchy's rot, evidence that autocracy itself was inherently decadent and doomed. Alexander Kerensky's provisional government had Rasputin's body exhumed and burned within months of the Tsar's abdication, specifically so his grave could not become a rallying site for monarchist sympathizers. Even in death, he remained too dangerous a symbol to be left alone. The myth kept growing long after the man was gone. Yusupov's self-serving memoir became the dominant historical source for decades, republished and dramatized in films throughout the 20th century, each retelling adding new embellishments: the poison, the resurrection, details invented by screenwriters with no connection to the actual events. By the time most people in the 20th century encountered the name Rasputin, they were encountering a folkloric monster, not a historical peasant who had genuinely shaped the final years of an empire. You have likely encountered his cultural shadow without realizing its origin. The name Rasputin has become political shorthand for any unelected figure who seems to hold outsized, shadowy influence over a leader. Commentators have reached for the comparison to describe everyone from 20th century court advisors to 21st century political strategists. The comparison is almost always imprecise, flattening a genuinely complicated historical figure into a simple metaphor for corruption. But the fact that the metaphor still gets reached for more than a century later tells you something true about the underlying fear it expresses. The fear that democratic or bureaucratic systems, no matter how carefully designed, can still be captured by a single unaccountable person who has found the right emotional lever to pull. This is your fourth present-day anchor. When you hear a modern politician's inner circle described as having a Rasputin problem, you are hearing an argument about accountability, not really about Rasputin himself. An argument that some form of power is being exercised without any of the formal scrutiny that power is supposed to require. That anxiety did not begin with Rasputin, but his story gave it its most durable name. The deeper legacy, though, is less about any single imitator and more about the pattern itself. Wherever a leader's decision-making is concentrated, unaccountable, and emotionally, rather than institutionally driven, something Rasputin-shaped becomes possible again. Russia's own 20th century would go on to produce new versions of concentrated, unaccountable power in different ideological clothing for decades after the Romanovs were gone. The specific man from Pokrovskoye died in a basement in 1916. The conditions that made him possible did not die with him. There is a deeper question sitting underneath everything you have just heard, and it is not the question the hook promised in Section 1. That question, how did one peasant gain so much power, has, by now, been answered as thoroughly as the historical record allows, through a dying child, a frightened mother, a hollow church, and an aristocracy blind to its own hypocrisy. The harder question is this. When a mother believes, with total sincerity, that one man alone can save her child's life, is it fair to call her faith foolish, even when the man turns out to be exploiting her? Or is that faith simply what desperation does to any human being, regardless of rank, when medicine has failed and nothing else remains? Alexandra was not a stupid woman. She was, by every account, a mother watching her only son bleed internally, with no reliable cure in sight, in an era when hemophilia was a near-certain death sentence. Rasputin may have been a manipulator, an opportunist, even genuinely believing his own performance, and he may also have been the only source of comfort that ever seemed to work, whatever the true mechanism behind it. Modern medicine offers a possible, unglamorous explanation that has nothing to do with mysticism at all. The doctors treating Alexei were, at the time, unknowingly administering aspirin, a medication we now understand to be a blood thinner, precisely the wrong treatment for a hemophiliac. Rasputin, with no medical training whatsoever, consistently insisted the doctors leave the boy alone. It is entirely possible that his real gift was not prophecy or divine healing, but simple, accidental removal of a harmful treatment, combined with whatever calming effect his presence had on an anxious household during a medical crisis science would not properly understand until decades later. If this explanation is correct, then the miracle that convinced an empress to trust a peasant with her nation's future was, in the end, an accident of 19th-century pharmacology, mistaken for the hand of God. Sit with that possibility for a moment, because it does not resolve anything. It deepens the discomfort instead. If Rasputin's healing was simply an unwitting byproduct of bad medicine being withheld, then everything that followed, the political access, the ministerial purges, the wartime chaos, the assassination, arguably even the timing of the empire's collapse, rests on a misunderstanding. A superstition mistaken for medicine helped bring down one of history's largest empires. So here is the question worth carrying with you. When an institution's own trusted experts have already failed a person, and someone outside that institution appears to succeed where the experts could not, how much scrutiny should that person actually receive before we hand them our trust? And does the answer change if the results, however achieved, genuinely seem to work? Rasputin's story does not answer this. It only proves how catastrophically expensive the wrong answer can become once trust has already been given and no one is left willing to take it back. Return, for a moment, to Pokrovskoye. Not the Pokrovskoye of legend, but the real one. Flat, cold, unremarkable. A scattering of wooden houses along a frozen river 1,000 miles from anywhere that mattered. Picture a 28-year-old peasant walking out of that village on foot, no map, no money, sleeping in fields, eating what strangers offered him out of pity or piety. He does not know on that first morning of walking that he is leaving behind a wife who will wait for him for the rest of his life, or that he is walking, however slowly, toward a palace, a throne, and eventually a basement not unlike the root-cellar chapel he first built with his own hands back home. There is a strange symmetry in that. He begins his transformation underground, in secret, among a handful of believers gathered in his father's cellar. He ends his life underground too, in another basement, among men who believed just as fervently that killing him was a form of salvation for their country. Between those two basements lies an entire empire's worth of desperation, faith, hypocrisy, and blood. The question this story leaves behind is not really about Rasputin at all. It was never really about him. It is about every frightened institution that has ever mistaken a confident outsider for a solution. Every grieving parent who has ever needed to believe someone, anyone, could fix what medicine could not. And every system so insulated from consequence that it could not recognize its own unraveling until the unraveling was already complete. Somewhere in an unmarked patch of ground outside Petrograd in 1917, soldiers acting on government orders burn what remains of a body that had already been shot, drowned in myth, and reassembled 100 different ways by 100 different storytellers, each one needing him to be something simpler than he actually was, purely evil, purely holy, purely mad. The fire erases the last physical trace of the man. It does nothing at all to the pattern he represents, because that pattern was never really his. It belonged to the empire that built the conditions for him, long before he ever left home. He walked out of Pokrovskoye, a wanderer with nothing. For 11 years, an empire mistook that nothing for something sacred. And when the fire finally took what was left of him on the outskirts of a capital that no longer bore the Tsar's name, the wandering, in a sense, never really ended. It simply changed shape, into a story that keeps walking, into any room, in any century, where the powerful are frightened enough to stop asking who they are really trusting, and why.